watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Monday evening. We're doing our first of two shows for the day. We have Abbott Nicholas coming on after this, but here we're joined by Jonathan Prejean and Eric Ibarra. We're going to be discussing one faith, but two metaphysics, namely Thomism and Scotism. So fun stuff. But first of all, welcome to the show, Jonathan. How are you?
Nice to meet you, Michael. Doing great.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well, even though it's only virtually, as I say, but still it's kind of the equivalent these days post-COVID, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we're doing a lot of this, aren't we?
Yeah, that's very true. Eric, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm good to be back on. I'm doing well. Just looking forward to what we can talk about.
Yeah, I'm going to have you on pretty soon to discuss your book on Melchizedek, right?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
I think you recently released that. Everybody go check it out. Is it available at Amazon?
Yeah, you can just type my name in, it comes up.
Good deal. All right, well, Jonathan, let's go ahead and dive in. We're talking Thomism and Scotism. Well, I mean, take us wherever you want to go with it.
And a couple other things. It's about 2,000 years of Christianity here, so it'll be fun. And let me know how long you guys can go. I don't know what the time limit is.
We have roughly an hour. Let's do about maybe 40 or so minutes of discussion, and then we'll take a few live chat questions.
Okay, well, I'll go fast. So to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Jonathan Prejean. I've been in apologetics and more like Catholic theology for quite a few years. I ran a blog called Crimson Catholic, and we did some back and forth. But to give you a little idea of my background, I started out, I've always had kind of a religious sensibility. I started out with Carl Sagan's Cosmos. That got me into just awe of creation generally, and got me into physics. I didn't have any kind of really formal religion in my childhood. We have learned about Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth. I don't know if you know him. He's a comparative religious scholar. And so I say my religion growing up was Star Wars. So, it kind of fits in with Jimmy Aiken last week. And I was glad I got out of that one before episode 8 came out. That's all I'll say about it. But what happened was when I got to law school, particularly, I was in this conflict between what I believed, which was there's reality, God exists, and what I saw as nihilism, pure will to power. And, that was just a secular mindset. And at that point I was like, look, I can't keep doing this. It doesn't make sense. I believe in God. I need to take my religion seriously. So I started, taking religious basic beliefs classes at St. Paul's in Cambridge. And the first lesson was about the Trinity. And Father Savage talked about the concept called perichoresis. And that just blew my mind because I was a physics guy, and it was just the most impressive thing. And once I heard that, I was like, whatever that is, that's what I want my religion to be. So basically, since I was confirmed at St. Thomas Aquinas in Dallas, I've been really interested in the concept of perichoresis and Eastern theology. And at some point, I around that time, I met Perry Robinson online, and we started talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, and I learned about it with him. And we've had, kind of a long dialogue. And my focus, the way I put it is, my focus is Catholic fundamental theology, because I came from a scientific background, and what fundamental theology is the answer to modernism. And from my perspective, the answer to nihilism too, because I think that's where modernism ultimately leads. So that's been my focus, is Catholic fundamental theology. And I was writing a lot, kind of on the philosophical area and having this dialogue with Eastern Orthodox Christians and some Thomist Catholics. And, I kind of got out of it because the way it was going was that the dialogue with Reformed and Orthodox became more and more presuppositionalist. And for a lot of reasons, I don't think that works. The exception was the website Called to Communion, which was run by Brian Cross, who is a Reform guy. And, that was mostly about Thomist appeals to Reformed Christians. And I wasn't actually particularly Thomist at the time, and I'd never been Reformed. So there wasn't really a place for me anymore. But now I think we're kind of getting into a point, and I mean, this show is actually an example of it, where we're getting back into real dialogue. And there's a lot of smart people talking about these philosophical issues in a different way. So I kind of feel like, it's come to a time where it's good to get back in. And it's also just a tough time in terms of, we're fighting against a lot of the nihilism in the culture today. So we're at a point where we kind of have to start doing something. And that's why I wanted to put something back out there. And what I hope to do was kind of get us on the same page with the Orthodox on the filioque being something that we can both believe. And that's what I'm about today. So to give it a little background on what fundamental theology is, there's a fundamental theologian named Francis Fiorenza who said it's the fundamental theology. It was developed as an independent theological discipline in reaction to the Enlightenment during the 18th and 19th centuries. So what do they mean by that? Okay, so that's Kant and Hume, skepticism about what we call knowledge. And I'm going to argue that's rooted in medieval nominalism. And what's interesting is Joseph Ratzinger was in the Faculty of Fundamental Theology at Bonn in 1959. So he's a guy who thinks along these lines. That's why he's been impressive to me. So the original version of fundamental theology was very strict Thomist, preambles of faith, motives of credibility for people who are in a state of inquiry. So it's just very defined. We're showing God made a supernatural revelation, established the church, founded by Christ as its divinely authorized custodian and interpreter. So it's very that way. But I think that what happened in modern science, really, in modern philosophy, was that we learned about the limits of formal systems. So you have things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Tarski's undefinability theorem, which basically says defining truth in a formal system can't be a product of the system, and Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And then we also had modern physics go into relativity and quantum mechanics. So what we had to confront was basically, as finite created beings, there are just limits as to how much formal structure we can put around things and how we can figure things out. But that doesn't mean we have to ignore truth. And what's interesting is this is actually stuff that people were talking about even in scholastic philosophy. So they talk about Baroque scholasticism. But you had guys like John of St. Thomas, Suarez, and guys like this who were looking critically at the assumptions that were being made in metaphysics. So even then in Catholicism, sort of outside of this whole modern picture, we had Catholics critically looking at, well, what can we be sure of in metaphysics? How much of this is real? And so that's really what I'm going to get at is we've always had the ability to have multiple metaphysical systems. And it's just we haven't actually confronted it. So what I don't want to do is talk like, to answer modernity, we need to go into fundamentalism. We need to just say, we need to be really confident about what it is we know. We need to be certain. We have to have metaphysical certainty about everything. Because what we should be learning is that you can have multiple paradigms, just like we do in science, that are all right and that all describe things and that all work. So the guys that I think of that have done this really well, St. John Henry Newman was one of the first people who started doing this. Pope St. John Paul II, Ratzinger was one of the guys. Bernard Lonergan, Jacques Maritain, who you've had discussions about. Maurice Blondel, and a couple of really contemporary guys, John Deely and Javier Zubiri, are a couple of modern philosophers who have really contributed to this area. So those are guys that I listen to. So what do I mean by fundamental theology? I think that if we are talking about which paradigms work, the ones that work for Christians are the ones that prove consistently that Jesus is God. So that's what a metaphysical paradigm has to do. We have to consistently and coherently say that Jesus is God. Now, why did I pick that? It's the same thing that you say in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. So that's the situation we're in if that's not real. And that's why this is a fundamental belief. If you've got a paradigm that doesn't consistently say Jesus is God, died and was resurrected, you've got problems. It's just never going to work as a Christian worldview. But in that range, there's a lot of things we can do. And so what I want to cut down on is unnecessary division. So I think if we have people who can believe coherently that Jesus is God, we should be able to say, you know what, even if we have different metaphysical explanations, we should still be able to commonly say that Jesus is God. And maybe we've got differences on how we explain it, but at the core, we're affirming the same thing. And I think that's where we are within Catholicism, but I think it's also where we are with Eastern Orthodoxy. And what we want to watch out for is what Matthew Levering talked about on Larry Chapp's show recently, the circular firing squad. We don't want to be in a situation where we're all shooting at each other and not dealing with the things that are external when we could be working together. And if you look at Christian history, that kind of separation. So we've gotten to the point with the Miaphysite churches and the Church of the East where we're like, we actually just had a misunderstanding. We think we can get to the point where we can agree or come together on some kind of common terminology where we've got a common framework. But that happened after centuries of division, and it's not even done yet. And so there's a book by Philip Jenkins called The Lost History of Christianity. And what that describes is basically the fall of the Church of the East, how it was bigger than all of the churches that we have today, bigger than Catholicism, bigger than Eastern Orthodoxy, and it was essentially gone. And you have to think about what could have happened if we'd have all been working together at that time, and there are real costs to unnecessary division. And, I think the filioque is one of those issues where we've had what I view as unnecessary division for a very long time. And what I don't want to say is that there aren't necessary divisions, because I think there are. But if we can find areas where it really is just a metaphysical disagreement, then we should be able to work together. So I see fundamental theology as a system to say, okay, is this division really unnecessary, or is it necessary to be able to coherently say that Jesus is God? And that's been my approach. So that's what I'm going after. So if we think about it metaphysically, the things we really need to affirm that Jesus is God. First, we need to understand that God is truly infinite, utterly simple, lacking nothing. So, we'll talk about a little bit about how simplicity is formulated, but that's basically it. God doesn't depend on anything else. He exists of himself. We take the position that God is triune, not out of some need, but out of basically his natural goodness. So it doesn't indicate a lack of something, like you might hear, Unitarians accuse us of requiring something in God. That's not what it's about. But it's consistent with God's infinity that God self-relates. And that's what the Trinity is about, is the self-relation of God that relies on nothing outside of God and requires nothing outside of God. And because of divine simplicity, because of how that works, the communications have to be absolutely perfect. And that sort of defines what the ad intra relations are, why we have three persons, not two persons, not one person, and not more than three persons. And that sharing of the same essence is what we call perichoresis. So that's what I got interested in. And that doesn't mean that we actually know what God is in himself. We can't. There are limits. But we can affirm God is infinite. That's not something that we can understand, but we express it. And that gives us an interpretive framework where we can say things about God without necessarily knowing things about God. So the fundamental principle that the pro-Nicene Christians use to show this and to show the unity of the three persons was that unity of nature is unity of power. So basically, if you had a person doing divine things, that meant that that was the same God as the other two persons. And this has been tracked in the scholarship by Michelle Renee Barnes and Louis Ayres. So those were the guys who kind of started this whole thing. One of the best books you can read in this area is The Power of God by Michelle Renee Barnes, that talks about how Gregory of Nyssa uses this idea of unified action means unified nature. And what we mean by that unity is even stronger than the persons working together. Basically, if they have the same essence, then they have the same power. That is, their power is numerically one. And that's the same reason that we say that there's one God, even though there's three persons. So even the power is the same in all of them. And what you get from that is that all of the acts of the persons have to be one. They have to be unified. It's called the doctrine of inseparable operations, but it really means identical operations. So we have situations where individual persons can be the object of a divine action. So you assume human nature to the Son alone. Only the Son acts through the humanity. But what causes the assumption, the divine act, is still according to the Trinity. So the Trinity causes the human nature to be assumed to the Son. You also have situations of appropriation where we say we recognize something about the role of the individual persons in the action because we know something about the relations between them. But that doesn't separate them. That doesn't mean that the individual persons are doing separate actions. That's not the case. What is the case is that we can think about what quality they're giving to the action. So when we talk about like the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, for example, all three of the persons are present in doing that, but that's still characteristic of the Spirit. And we understand it that way. And that's basically to give us a better way to understand, because we don't know what it's like to have identical essence. We don't know what it's like to be one God. So this is kind of an accommodation that God has provided to us to let us understand. And it's really that unity of power. That's why it was such a great pro-Nicene argument, because the unity of power is really what defines what God's omnipotence is. That's what makes God separate from the rest of us. So basically what that requires for us to have a coherent belief about God is that we have to have some concept of nature. Because otherwise we can't understand three persons, one nature. We can't understand two natures in Christ. So what are natures? What is that? What have we been given to understand? That's basically the good ideas that God has about creation. That's the easiest way to understand nature. You can get a lot more complicated than that, but that's it. One of the important aspects of Christian theology is that evil is defined in opposition to nature. So we think that evil is a violation of nature and that evil isn't really real. It's a stick on nature. So the idea of nature is not just important so that we can understand what God is, but it's important so that we can understand what the world is and how we can distinguish it from Manichaean systems or systems with a demiurge that has some evil creation or something like that. What nature gives us is an idea of good that we can then define evil against. So what nature does for us is it makes God comprehensible. Once you get rid of the doctrine of natures, we don't really have any way to relate to God. And we know we can't relate to him directly, or comprehend him in his infinite nature anyway. But if natures aren't real things, then we don't have a way as finite human beings to understand what God is. But when we talk about what exactly natures are, that's where it starts getting metaphysical. And that's kind of where I'm going to start. So, how natures exist is an unresolved metaphysical question. So we've got a couple of different Christian schools on created natures. They're Neoplatonic, which is basically divine natures existing as divine ideas in the mind of God. That's the Christian version of it. And then individuals participate in those things. And there are a lot of Platonic Christians in the early fathers. I point to Gregory of Nyssa, Dionysius the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, John Damascene, and then later in medieval theology, you see Bonaventure and Duns Scotus are really in that school. They're thinking in a Platonic metaphysics. The alternative is an Aristotelian metaphysics. So that's where natures are really finite modes of imitating God's perfect act of existence. And so that is what I think of with Augustine, Boethius, Thomas Aquinas, and it's really been kind of a dominant paradigm in the West. And with those, you have two different Christian schools on divine infinity. And, I talk about what the importance of infinity is. This is really where the difference comes up. So there's a Neoplatonic idea, which is God is infinite by being infinitely perfect in every way. So I think of that as like formal infinity. So there's this form of like the intellect or various things, and God is basically infinitely those good things. The Aristotelian approach is that God is infinite by being what we could think of as infinitely existent. So he's the pure act of being, the ipsum esse subsistens. And so those are kind of two different approaches to infinity, but they both work. So where I come down is, as long as you can affirm two things, natures exist, and whatever you think natures are, God is infinite, you're okay. And those terms are philosophical, but the concepts are really biblical. So if you think about it, where this comes from, where there's all this discussion about natures, it's in the Bible. It's talking about how things are created. So this isn't something that we need to think of as completely philosophical. The metaphysics is just a way of explaining what we understand from the affirmation of God as creator. The other important thing is that it immediately hits soteriology. And this is one of those discussions that we have a lot. So salvation is really unity of the natures in Christ. And the big quote for that is, and for their sake, I consecrate myself that they may also be sanctified in truth. So that's in John 17:19. And Augustine and other fathers use that as an explanation. So what they're basically saying there is Christ uses his deified nature to convey grace to us. And that's how you get the sacraments. That's how you get everything. So again, if you get natures wrong, you can't understand participation in the divine nature, and you can't understand soteriology or the sacraments, how they really work. So you've got people like Donald Winslow said that the unity of Christ's person for Gregory Nazianzen is theosis. That's it, the perichoresis between the natures. Augustine says the same thing in his explanation of deification. So we've got this idea that Christ being both divine and human explains our soteriology. And that's a key concept on both sides going, well, until today, basically. And the point there is we've got a lot more in common than people think. But there's this tendency to let the metaphysical differences obscure that. And so that's what I'm going to get to. We've got a couple of different approaches metaphysically to the Trinity itself. The Trinity is tough because it's something that we can't really understand completely. Because we say that the persons are one and the same God, but they're not the same as each other. Prima facie, that's a logical contradiction. because it's not even saying they're the same kind of thing or anything like that. That's saying they are literally the same God and not the same thing. So we have to come up with some sort of metaphysical explanation that's more complicated. And there have been a couple of different approaches to it. So there's an Eastern approach, and I'd point to Gregory Nazianzen for that one, which is the logic of relations is to avoid dialectic. So you say when counting the Trinity, you skip 2 and immediately go to 3. And he had a quote in his 40th oration that says, "No sooner do I conceive of the one than I am illumined by the splendor of the 3. No sooner do I distinguish them than I am carried back to the 1." So there's this play between 1 and 3 at all times. And what's interesting is that was actually a contrast with Origen, because Origen had an idea of motion that was Neoplatonic and involved dyads. So you'll hear about relations of opposition. That's what that is. So Gregory's trying to fight that by saying, no, we're not doing this Neoplatonic counting thing where you say it's this and not that, and then this and not that. We can say they're 1 and 3 at the same time. Augustine had a completely different approach to this. And that was the part that was really interesting to me. So what Augustine did, and this comes from a book, it's by Paul Thom, H-O-M. It's called The Logic of Trinity. I haven't seen a lot of people using this. But what he did was say, okay, I think that the categories can apply to God, but in a special way. So substance works for God, but we can't say that he has accidents. The other category that Augustine brings into God, which nobody had ever done before, was relation. Because in Aristotle, relation is an accident. And Augustine said, no, relation can be a fundamental metaphysical category for God. And that's a difference that nobody had seen before. And honestly, nobody else uses it. But it was the core metaphysical view that started Aristotelian Christian metaphysics. So that and that was followed all the way until you get to St. Thomas, until you get to Duns Scotus, till you get to Bonaventure. All of those people followed Augustine in this definition of relations. And so what's interesting about what Augustine says is that the relative properties individualize as pointing to rather than being in. And what that means is that if you think about them as properties in, then you go back to the essence. If you think of them as pointing to, they distinguish people. And that metaphysical innovation is the thing that, in my view, separated the West from the East. We had some commonalities, but that's the piece where we were going one direction and the East was going a different direction. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So knowing this, that we have two different ideas of relation, what I asked myself was, is there any way that we can put those two together? So what I said was, okay, well, maybe we can just say, what's the logical content of that statement? So forget about the metaphysics. Let's try to make it a completely logical statement. And so I followed a guy named Thomas Ryba, who'd written an article in Augustine Presbyter Factus Sum on what the logic of relations were, just purely logical. And what he said was, you can think about it as a reflexive relation on a mathematical set. And the way a reflexive relation works in this case is you take a relation of the set back to itself, and that makes a copy. And then you can take another relation of the set back to itself and its copy, and that makes a third person, a second copy. And that's basically a mathematical definition of what an image is. So I said, okay, well, that makes sense. It's called a reflexive relation because the relation looks back on itself. That's not the same thing as reflexive identity. So you might have hear about the law of reflexivity, where A equals A. These relations are actually irreflexive for purposes of identity. So you say, okay, well, the Father is distinct from the Son. but they're reflexive in the sense that they go back. So I said, okay, well, that I understand. So that makes sense. That's a mathematical definition of the image. So then the question is, okay, well, have we seen that theologically? The answer is, yeah, we have. Okay. So we know that the Son is the image of the Father, so Father's a prototype. The Son is the image of the Father. But what doesn't get discussed a lot is that there were also Eastern fathers that said the Spirit is the image of the Son, which is exactly the thing that I was saying would make sense if we think of the Trinitarian relations as copying. So what Athanasius first said was they quoted Romans 8:29, saying we're meant to be conformed to the image of the Son. And they said, well, what's the image of the Son? The image of the Son is the Holy Spirit. Not what you'd usually see, but it's not a bad exegetical argument. So I started looking at, okay, where did that come from? Where have we seen this image of the Son stuff? And then Father Deacon Anton Usher, a friend of ours, had pointed me to a couple of different examples where they use the image of the Son in the East. So in a really old creed from St. Gregory Thaumaturgus, it describes one Holy Spirit having his subsistence from God and being made manifest by the Son, and you'll recognize that language, perfect image of the perfect Son. And then Athanasius uses image of the Son all over the place. So he's in Ad Serapion, he's like, as the Son is in the Spirit as his own image, so also the Father is in the Son. And then there was the Spirit is said to be and is the image of the Son. The Spirit is an image of the Son. Where the light, that's the Father, is, there is also the radiance, Son. And where the radiance is, there is also its activity and lambent grace. So you've got all these situations where he's talking about the Spirit being an image of the Son. And St. Gregory of Nyssa, he quoted St. Gregory Thaumaturgus for it. St. Athanasius uses it explicitly. St. Cyril of Alexandria uses it. But St. John Damascene also uses this phrase. So he says on the Holy Images, part 3, for the Son is the natural image of the Father, unchangeable, and everything like to the Father, except that he is begotten, and that he is not the Father. The Father begets, being uncreated. The Son is begotten, and is not the Father. And the Holy Spirit is the image of the Son. And he also says, the Son is image of the Father, and the image of the Son is the Spirit, through whom the Christ dwelling in man gives it to him to be the image of God. So I found all these things on the image of the Spirit, on the Spirit being the image of the Son, which to me says exactly the same thing that we say with the Filioque. So then I found out that St. Thomas Aquinas actually agrees with St. John Damascene that they're the same, that we're saying the same thing. So in Summa Theologia 135.2, he basically explains, he's like, yeah, we don't really use the term image because Scripture only calls the Son the image of the Father, but he's not wrong. This is correct. So from my perspective, I said, okay, well then, if the Spirit's the image of the Son, we're done. We're in the same position on the Filioque. We've solved the problem, right? And then I heard about Father Kappas, and the way this came up was Cabane, who's an Orthodox blogger, was he gave a nice summary of what the problem was with the Filioque. He said, well, Scotism may be able to work. Maybe we can agree on Scotism on that in the Filioque. But because that's compatible with Palamas, because Father Kappas says it's compatible, but we'll have to give up Thomism. And so I said, well, that's a problem because, my position is basically, I think Scotism and Thomism are the same on this. And honestly, we don't have a problem with any of them. So that started some of the discussion back and forth, where I said, look, I got to say something here. So basically, where Father Kappas and I agreed was that, yes, there were some Thomists who were saying bad things about Palimism, that were basically saying this is our triumphalist metaphysical system. So they were saying, Palimism has these problems. It's bad. It's Scotism. It's bad. And, the Neopalamite response was pretty bad. So they said, well, your concept of person is defective. You guys are rationalists. Your Thomism is terrible, blah, blah, blah. So Father Kappas really explained, no. Look, there were some really bad Latin arguments that were being made. But we shouldn't hold that against Palimism. Had they just had a discussion with Scotus, they'd have been fine. So where I disagree is, I'm like, no, I think we're all fine, right? I think that there's no problem with this. And so what I point to is, first of all, Augustine's metaphysics wasn't Platonic. It was Aristotelian. And, I can point to a number of things, but I think that Paul Thom has done a very good job of showing why Augustine was really not being Platonic. He was being Aristotelian. And what I think he was about was, he was taking an older account of creation. And I think that came from Athanasius. So there's a book by Khaled Anelios called Athanasius, The Coherence of His Thought. And Father Antolios is a Melkite priest and a scholar who's at Notre Dame. And so what Athanasius focuses on is that things are called from non-being. So it's that statement in Romans 4:17 that says God calls into existence the things that do not exist. And that's how Athanasius sees it. He sees us as being pulled from non-being. And our ability is to approach God through grace, but we also have the ability to turn ourselves towards non-being, and that's sin. And I think if you look at Athanasius and Augustine, there's a book called The One Christ that's about Augustine's theology of creation and deification. I think it's exactly the same as what Athanasius is saying. And what I think defines that is that you basically have two models. One of them focuses on the relation with creation. That's being called from non-being, and builds the entire system around it. The other one is the Platonic emanation idea. So that basically says things come out of God. That's where I think our entire problem has been. So, and there's a lot that could be said about that, and I can fill in more details later. But that's what I think the problem is. We've got these two different accounts of creation. One is emphasizing God calling things from non-being. So that's Athanasius, that's Augustine, that's Hilary, that's Saint Cyril, that's Leo the Great. Those are the guys who are in the relational model. Then you have the Neoplatonic side of things, which is emanationist. So that's Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Gregory Nazianzen, Diodore, Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret. They've got the emanationist idea and not the relationist idea. So what happened? And I, by the way, I think Gregory of Nyssa, I think he's basically relationalist. I think he's got the same idea. He has a Platonic metaphysics, which is interesting, but I think his idea is mostly relational because he has the same concept of infinity. He has the same idea of epictasis, which is created things stretching towards God's infinity. I think that's the same idea of deification that Athanasius and St. Augustine have. So that's what happened. So where did we go wrong? And this is where I disagree with Father Kappas, because I think there really were two ideas. I don't think these were all the same. I don't think Augustine was a Platonist. I don't think he was doing any of this. So where did we go wrong? I think Cyril was the last guy who understood both sides. That's why I think he was the guy who could talk at Chalcedon. He spoke both languages. So he was a guy who understood what Athanasius was saying. He had corresponded with Augustine. He understood what Augustine was saying too. So I think he understood both of the ideas. He understood relationalism. He understood emanationism. And so he has this dialogue with Theodoret, and Theodoret is absolutely an emanationist because he's fighting against the Origenist idea that that the Son created the Spirit. That's what he's worried about. So he's fighting against that Origenist idea. And that fight is essentially, Cyril's like, no, I'm not saying anything wrong. I'm just saying, that the spirit of the essence of the Son, which is this perfectly good relational language that Athanasius used. And Theodoret is like, well, do you mean that the Son is getting his subsistence from the Son, or that the Spirit's getting his subsistence from the Son? Because that would be terrible. And Cyril says, no, what I said was he's from the Son's nature, but he's not, I'm not saying that he's the Father. I'm just saying that he's from the Son's nature. So I think Cyril was just fine with both of these. And I think that honestly, that most of the East was fine with both of them, except the people who had big problems with Origenism. And that's where everything breaks down. So to me, when Origen comes in, they really start having problems with Origenism in the 6th century. And they are really worried about not having a situation where you've got pre-existent souls, necessary creation, all of these problems. So what happened was there's this pressure to resolve Origenism. And right at that time, we get really influential writings of Dionysius. So the reason that he was probably anonymous and chose Dionysius as a pseudonym is because of these fights. At the time, everybody's yelling at everybody. You've got Monophysites, you've got Origenists, you've got all. And so he was probably in a situation where he was going to be in danger if they figured out who wrote it. So he picks Dionysius. And there's a really interesting book by Rosemary Arthur called Pseudo-Dionysius as Polemicist that explains kind of the background and why this would have happened. So when you had Dionysius come in, that he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Everybody was Dionysian after that. That was the norm. And you look at people afterwards, St. Maximus follows Dionysius, St. John Damascene follows Dionysius, everybody follows Dionysius. So he becomes the normative, the normative approach, and that's basically Neoplatonism. So the older relational account just goes away. Nobody really believes that anymore. And so by the time you get to St. Photius, he's a pure emanationist. He doesn't see anything, doesn't have anything outside of the relational model. So when he's looking back at like Athanasius or St. Cyril, he doesn't see the relational model at all. He's always trying to read it back into the emanationist model. And probably the best example was he's the guy who criticized St. Clement of Alexandria, who was sort of an older style, guy, really anti-Origenist. And he even convinced the West to stop venerating St. Clement of Alexandria, because St. Clement has a metaphysics that's not, it doesn't fit in with the Neoplatonism, or doesn't fit in perfectly. So he's just very suspicious of this whole thing. And that's what happened. So what happened was St. Athanasius and St. Cyril had this relational model of creation, deification, the Trinitarian relations, all of those things. And that basically carried on in the West. Athanasius was basically doing that. All he did was come up with an Aristotelian system that worked for that model. And that's what we have in the West today, right? But once Dionysius came along in the East, that was the only game in town. So then by the time St. Photius gets there, he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand. He really doesn't even understand what St. Athanasius and what St. Cyril were doing, but he certainly doesn't understand what St. Thomas Aquinas, what St. Augustine was doing. And so, I've made more arguments on this, but what I think happened, and if you look at Tom, I think this is exactly what happened, is Boethius was, the philosopher at the time. He basically took St. Augustine, worked on his metaphysical system a little bit, came up with a more Augustinian but Aristotelian system. And then St. Thomas Aquinas writes a commentary on Boethius. So he does the same thing as St. Augustine was doing and Boethius was doing. And it's very Aristotelian. He tries to combine those two, the Neoplatonism, but later on, and Father Kappas actually pointed that out to me, as he was much more Neoplatonic at the beginning, but later on, he's working this out. And so he becomes less and less Neoplatonic and more Aristotelian, in the sense that Augustine was Aristotelian. So basically that's the pitch, right? And you can go into a lot, and really Bonaventure and Scotus kind of take the Platonic metaphysics back and start doing the same thing. But it's really the same discussion that we've been having forever. And I think it just goes back to Athanasius. But then you see there's this relational model and there's the Neoplatonic model. And those two are metaphysically different. And I don't know any way to put the two of them together. And I don't see a way to do that. But here's my point. We're at a point now where we're sophisticated about metaphysics. We can understand, you know what? It's possible to have two different paradigms. We can have a situation where, we've got two different approaches, maybe even more different approaches. So where I think people have gone wrong is trying to cram both of these metaphysical systems into each other's boxes. I don't think it works. I don't think it's ever going to work. And you guys had like Jared Goff on. He's like, no, they're incommensurable. You can't be a Thomist and a Scotist, right? But that's the story behind it, is having two different metaphysics is not something we should be worried about, because you may not be able to agree on this. I don't know, maybe Suarezism is better. Maybe Zuberianism is better. Maybe Palomism is better. But maybe we can't answer all of these questions. We shouldn't be committed to one of these schools. And that's where I think a lot of people have gone wrong. I think David Bradshaw has taken the Dionysian view and reread Augustine in terms of the Dionysian view. And I don't think he's right about it. I don't think that Augustine was using Aristotelian energia in the way that Dr. Bradshaw thinks he is. But that's because the way Dr. Bradshaw is looking at it, there's one metaphysics. That metaphysics is what got developed by Dionysius in the East. And, there's not a lot you can do about that. But all I can say is we keep having these discussions, and you got smart guys, Dr. Matthew Meinert and Father Kappas and Dr. Jared Goff and Dr. Bradshaw. They're all these smart guys, and yet we still keep trying to cram those metaphysics together. And I think it's just not working, and it's never going to work. And so what I would want people to try is think about whether it's okay for us both to have different metaphysical systems and still be able to agree on dogma. And that's honestly where I am. And I'm willing to discuss that with anybody. And I've got a lot more stuff that I can go through. But that's the idea, is like, why do we need to keep having these squabbles? Was Zhuxi's fight with the Palamites worth anything, or did that just divide us when we didn't need to be divided? And I think like even things like Florence is probably the best example I would give of this comedy of errors. You have a situation where the Thomists are trying to understand what Palamas is saying in their own terms. Palamas, Mark of Ephesus, is trying to understand what the West is saying in their own terms. It just doesn't work. And then, you've got a situation with Blackernay where it makes perfect sense if you think about it in terms of an internal structure, an internal struggle between emanationists. They're saying, we're worried about Origenism, Beckos, and you haven't really made us feel good about that. But it doesn't make any sense. I mean, what they were talking about there has really nothing to do with the Filioque in the West, but they couldn't speak the same language. So, that's what I would say, is I think we're at the point where we can look back and say, you know what, we don't need to fight over this anymore. And that's what I hope will happen, is that we got to the point where it's like, look, we don't need to fight over this anymore. There are things that we could fight over. We can fight. You can still have your discussion with the Orthodox on papal infallibility. There's something that we can fight over. But on this matter of faith, on whether Jesus is God, we're just explaining the same thing in two different ways, as far as I can tell.
Eric, we have 10 minutes left, so go ahead and jump in here, and I'll offer some of your comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate that. I know you could have gone more, but I do want to say that I definitely lean in your direction, because it's just not possible that Augustine, Hilary of Poitiers, Ambrose, Pope Leo, Pope Gregory were teaching an emanationist view of the Trinity. That's just not what they were doing. What they were doing was that classic doctrine of the one and the subsistent relations within. I agree, and that's why they kept saying the Spirit is the Spirit is of the Father and of the Son. That's all they needed to know that the Filioque was true.
Well, and it wasn't. I mean, this is the thing. They were working without a net. There is no classical Trinity, and so what happened was there was a Neoplatonic Triad, but they didn't go for that. In fact, Augustine basically rejects Marius Victorinus, who was, he was big into the triads and the Middle Platonic Triads. So that was out there, but that just wasn't what Athanasius or Augustine or Gregory of Nyssa were doing. And what's interesting about that is none of those guys were really into Neoplatonic philosophy. Like, they knew about it, but they weren't students of it, and they didn't follow it the way Origen did. Athanasius, even though he was in Alexandria, was not very high on Origen. Right. And so you get these guys who aren't very philosophically, they're not really Neoplatonist. And Augustine basically came up with his own thing. That's all it is. It's not really a classical thing at all. It's just, maybe relations are real things. Maybe that's it. And it's a new idea. And we just ran with it in the West.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can go on and on. We'll probably have to have another whole show for this, but I think that you're right, that they're irreconcilable. But at the end of the day, two different kinds of lawnmowers can cut the grass maybe two different ways, And I think that we need to start focusing on how we are arriving at a coherent Trinity two different ways. But I'll give it over to Michael, but I agree with you on that point, yeah.
I think it would be great to have a part two. In fact, I think maybe we could even have a roundtable discussion on this if y'all would be interested.
Yeah, I definitely. And there's a lot of guys like, we talked to Nathaniel McCallum and guys like that. I think there is a lot I think there's a lot of room here. And we just haven't had the discussion is honestly because people don't take it seriously. They're like, the fathers have to agree on this. They just have to. There's no way around it. And that just didn't happen. That's about all I can say about it. Is they just didn't agree on this. They looked at it a couple of different ways. And the good thing about thinking about it this way is it doesn't even have to be two. I mean, we already know three, because Palimism, Thomism, and Scotism are three different approaches, three different metaphysical approaches. Maybe Palimism is closer to Scotism, but in some ways it isn't. I mean, Dr. Matthew Minard was talking about, basically how Scotism doesn't necessarily require the object of faith to be supernatural, which is a huge problem for Palimism. And so, you've got three different systems. Maybe they all work. I think the other thing is, and I didn't get to talk about this. The other thing is, I think everything went wrong with William of Ockham. I don't think there is anybody who, there's no Ockhamist schools left anymore, but I don't think anybody thinks what he did to theology, getting rid of natures, going nominalist, that's been just a disaster. And I think that disaster is responsible for many, many more things than the division between East and West. And people try to blame Scotus for Occam, and I don't think that's fair either. To me, that's the problem. If you want to talk about philosophical doctrines that created just insurmountable problems, Occamism is where it all goes wrong.
Perhaps we can discuss that in a part two, which again I'd love to do. And if you're so inclined, we can schedule that here in a little bit.
I'd be happy to.
But thanks so much for coming on the show, Jonathan. This was excellent.
Right.
And put in a plug for anything that you're working on and you want the viewers and listeners to be aware of.
Well, yeah, and I don't have anything to plug because I'm just a blogger, So it's like we'll just get it in. But
what's the name of the blog?
crimsoncatholik.blogspot.com. But so I've got a couple of articles people can read there. But really, I'm like, guys, keep watching this show, and pay attention to what's going on, because this is where we're learning things. And the discussions that are happening now are so much better than they have been in a long time. And, the more people pay attention to that, the better things are going to get. And I'm just hoping, I'm really hoping that this can end up getting to the point where we have more peace and better discussions among everybody, because I think if we can just disarm on the metaphysical side, things are going to get much better, because it seems like all the divisiveness is just about my metaphysical system has to be right or everything's going to fall apart. And I don't think that's the truth.
Well said. Eric, go ahead and put in a plug for your material.
Yeah, just ericybarra.org, and I'll be here. We're doing a show on my book here soon, and then I think we're going to do another show on Vigilius in a week or two or something like that. So look forward to it.
Yeah, that's going to be really fun. hot button topic. All right. Well, everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and also check us out here in just a few minutes. We have Abbot Nicholas, who's going to be coming on to discuss synodality and history, and also how it impacts ecumenism. So stay tuned for more. We'll see y'all all in a little bit. God bless.